Welcome everyone to our webinar. We're really excited to have you join us all online today. Just whilst we wait for a few people to join us, I'll introduce myself. My name's Tom Novotny, and together with our two speakers, we'll delve into the topic of sustainable supply chains, assessing ESG performance for your service providers. So before we begin, I'll cover off some housekeeping. You can ask any questions during the talks by popping them in the Ask a Question option under the video, and our speakers will aim to answer them at the end of the session. You can also find additional resources in the attachment section and rate this webinar to let us know your comments or suggestions. All of today's slides and recordings will be emailed to you, so feel free to share with them with your colleagues or anyone who might also find this session useful. Right, we can begin. So just if you've not heard of SEDEX and it's your first time of hearing of us, allow me to give you a brief introduction. So SEDEX has 20 years experience as a global leader in sustainable supply chain management. We have a strong community of over 85,000 members and 104,000 supplier sites. Together with our platform and services, we enable businesses to easily manage and improve their environmental, social, and governance performance to meet their supply chain sustainability goals. I don't want to also forget about mentioning SMETA, the world's leading social audit methodology designed to assess and uphold responsible business practices across global supply chains. We have some really great insights coming to you today, so without further ado, allow me to introduce our speakers today. So today with us, we have Tom Saul, who's our social sustainability manager. Tom's been at SEDEX for almost 10 years, where he leads the methodology design of SEDEX's online assessment tools, including our risk assessment tool and self-assessment questionnaires, as well as Sab. Sab's our product manager here at SEDEX, and he's been with us for around 6 years. He's worked across a breadth of products from supply onboarding to buyer insights, and is currently working in the assessment space before leading on the self-assessment questionnaire for service providers. Today, we've got a jam-packed agenda for you. So today we'll be discussing why and how to assess your service providers, human rights due diligence as a mandatory requirement, and how supplier data collection tools can help assess your service provider suppliers. We'll also have some time at the end for any questions you may have, which our speakers will be happy to answer. Right, so with that, I'll hand over to Tom. Tom, take it away.
Thank you very much, Tom. So as Tom said, my name is also Tom, and I work across the SEDEX products on methodology, design, and content. So it's great to be here with you today. I'll spend the next few minutes outlining why businesses should be assessing their service providers and how to go about doing that. First, let's clarify what we mean by service providers at SEDEX, given that's what we will be talking about today. And to help that, it's useful to first explain what it's not. So often when we talk about suppliers at SEDEX, it's in reference to a supplier of a good or a product. We define a goods provider as an entity that produces, manufactures, or finishes a physical item. That could be items that are sold to end consumers, like a pair of jeans, or goods that are not for resale, like a shopping trolley. The key thing being that there's a physical item involved. Service providers, on the other hand, provide a service, like the cleaning, security, or construction of a store, an office, or a hotel, or the transportation or storage of goods, for example. Labor providers, recruitment agencies, and sourcing agents also provide a crucial service to many businesses, with the physical good provided by agents having been manufactured by another entity. So hopefully now that's clear, we'll look at why companies should be assessing their service providers as part of an ESG strategy. And the first point to make here really is that there's an expectation placed upon businesses to carry out corporate sustainability or human rights and environmental due diligence. And this really stems from the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, which made clear back in 2011 that businesses should be assessing their negative impacts across their own operations, subsidiaries, and value chains. And value chain, as opposed to supply chain, means all the activities involved in the production of goods or provision of services from start to finish. So that includes transportation, storage, and all the other services that take place upstream and downstream in the supply chain. Now, we know that most companies have prioritized assessing the risks of the suppliers that produce the goods that end up being sold to consumers. Often they're first-tier manufacturing facilities, but also pack houses, growers, producers, and other raw materials suppliers. But from our conversations with businesses, We also know that assessing service provider suppliers is often a blind spot for businesses, even the largest multinationals in many cases, and that there's real demand for solutions that will help to fill that gap. In part, that's because there's a lot more scrutiny in this area. And in particular, that's thanks to the rise in due diligence becoming mandatory rather than voluntary, as was the case with the UN Guiding Principles. If you take, for instance, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD as it's known, in the EU. CSDDD demands that companies have robust systems for acting on and managing human rights and environmental due diligence. And it's explicit within the directive that includes services like the distribution, transportation, and storage of goods. Many of the companies you work for will no doubt be affected by this regulation. And countries outside of the EU are taking note too, recognizing that mandatory due diligence has become a global norm and a core strategy for addressing human rights abuses. So we're seeing a real shift occurring as voluntary frameworks are hardened into legal requirements. And that creates the risk of significant legal and financial consequences. So in doing so, that's really shifting conversations about due diligence from sustainability teams and into boardrooms. So there's an inward-facing risk for business from that. But the second angle that must also be considered is in terms of the risk to workers and the environment. This outward-facing risk is the primary lens through which human rights and environmental due diligence takes place, and what these laws and regulations are aiming to address. So although the risks vary in different regions and countries, there are certain service provider sectors, such as transportation, cleaning, security, construction, waste disposal, and the provision of labour, where we tend to see a set of characteristics which mean that there is often a high risk to workers. These sectors are typically characterised by low-skilled work that's labour-intensive, often carried out by more vulnerable workers, including migrant workers and casual workers or day labourers. These workers face heightened risks of exploitation, wage theft, poor working conditions, and unethical recruitment, often with limited access to social protections. In many cases, workers are employed under precarious contracts, and complex subcontracting arrangements and third-party labour providers can really complicate that accountability. Some workers, like cleaners, might be working outside of regular working hours, while others are on the move in vehicles or at sea and therefore out of the scope of assessments that take place at a fixed location, like a manufacturing site or a farm. So the result is that across all these sectors, we know that these risks to workers do materialise in reality, including instances of forced labour or modern slavery, irrespective of whether that's in developing countries or advanced economies. Some service providers also contribute significantly to environmental issues. For example, waste management companies might be linked to improper disposal practices, pollution, and non-compliance with hazardous waste regulations. Logistics and transportation providers contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, making it essential to monitor and mitigate these environmental impacts. So by proactively assessing service providers, particularly in these sectors, businesses can better identify risks and implement actions to mitigate or prevent them. Now we'll look briefly at the steps that businesses can take to be in a position to do just that. And helpfully, we already have an established framework for conducting human rights due diligence. And this is designed to help companies identify, prevent, and mitigate human rights abuses and environmental harm. I'll briefly outline the core components, starting with risk identification and assessment. So after making a policy commitment to carry out human rights due diligence, the first step is to assess your service providers for potential human rights violations. That could be forced labour, discrimination, or unsafe working conditions. Identifying these risks early allows you to take preventative action. As an initial starting point, you'll need to identify who your service providers are, what services they provide, and whether those services could be considered high risk. The next step in the process is to take what you learn from these assessments and integrate those findings into your business decisions. So this ensures that key departments are informed and that you develop action plans tailored to address specific risks. For this to be effective, you'll need to bring together diverse functions of the business, like sustainability teams, compliance, and procurement teams as well. The following step is to continuously monitor the effectiveness of your measures, so you can adjust your strategies as needed to prevent any future violations, as much as possible, trying to keep your risk management approach dynamic and responsive. Finally, you should keep stakeholders informed about how you're managing human rights and environmental risks. And if an issue arises, you need to be prepared to collaborate with affected individuals or communities to offer effective remedies. which means so far as possible, restoring them to the position they would have been in had the impact not occurred. The goal of following these steps is to protect human rights, and in doing so, it will also strengthen your ESG performance and contribute to a more responsible global value chain. As we've already mentioned, for many companies, carrying out these steps is no longer really optional. It is a regulatory requirement, and there'll be penalties for those who fail to implement effective measures. So on that cautionary note, I'll now hand over to Sab, who's going to give an example of how an update to one of Sedex's tools could help with your service provider risk assessment process.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. I am Sab, and I'm a product manager here at Sedex, leading on the service provider SAQ. Now that we have learned the importance of assessing service providers in your supply chain, I will talk a bit about how the new self-assessment questionnaire, or SAQ, as we call it within Sedex, designed specifically for service providers, can help you to identify risks associated with suppliers who provide a service and effectively manage them. Before creating this new SAQ for service providers, we did some research. We spoke to our customers to understand what would be the best due diligence efforts and looked at what assessments already exist to help us define some key design principles. Speaking to our members, we found that in terms of the assessments in the market already, they tend to be sector specific or topic specific. But our members were looking for a solution with a wider breadth of both risk issues and service provider categories. However, that doesn't mean asking the same questions to all service providers. To give you an example, we know that some businesses will send the same questionnaire to a law firm with highly paid professionals as they do to a cleaning company using subcontracted labor. But that's not necessarily the best way to generate actionable information. So our questionnaire focuses on identifying the particular characteristics of the service providers, assigning the questions that are relevant to those characteristics, and therefore generating information that is useful and usable. And lastly, it was also important for us to align this new questionnaire as much as possible with our existing self-assessment questionnaire for goods providers, both in terms of the questions asked and the outputs you receive after a supplier has completed the SAQ. So how does this work in practice? When we created this new SAQ, we also redesigned the onboarding journey to make it suitable for service providers, which means when a supplier registers on Sedex, the platform will ask them a series of scoping questions, and the supplier receives an SAQ, which is tailored to their business type. In the background, the SAQ gets generated as a function of specific characteristics, which reflect key risk factors, such as, is the work considered low skill? And by that, we don't mean whether the workers are skilled, but does the work require high levels of qualification or only low levels of qualification? Who is carrying out the work? Are there employees or is the work subcontracted? We know this is very common in many service activities, and that decreased visibility leads to increased risk. Where is the work carried out? The location of the work within service industries is also significant. And in addition to the above, there are some more variations based on the size of the company and specific questions that are only relevant for recruitment agencies and sourcing agents due to the nature of their businesses. Here, you can see the key topics that are covered within the SAQ itself. There's a broad alignment with our other products like the goods provider SAQ and SMETA audit, collecting worker data and covering the breadth of labor standards, plus environmental management systems where relevant and business ethics. Questions will also vary within given sections based on the characteristics identified. Questions within the health and safety section, in particular, will be dependent on the workplace location. There are also parent-child questions where additional questions within a section are asked based on the answers to a previous question. In terms of the output of the SAQ upon completion, you get the management control score and report, which allows suppliers to identify their areas of improvement, and risk assessment scores, which helps buyers identify risk levels of their supplier. We have seen a huge uptake of the new service provider SAQ after launching it in August this year, with more than 30 service provider categories completing the new SAQ so far. This demonstrates the dynamic nature of the assessment and how it is relevant for a diverse set of service providers ranging from high-risk activities such as transportation of goods and freight, storage, cleaning, security, and labor providers, to those activities which require high-skilled work, like in IT industries, professional, and financial services. And where are these service providers located? As you can see here, there is a diverse set of countries where the suppliers have answered the new service provider SAQ. This illustrates how contrasts the geographical presence of service provider supply chains compares to those of goods providers, whereas suppliers of goods will typically be in major sourcing countries like China, India, and Vietnam. We are seeing companies assess their direct service providers in the countries of their head offices, with brands and retailers within the UK and Australia leading the way so far. I will now hand back to Tom, who will talk about managing service provider risks.
Thanks, Seb. So yeah, after using tools like SAQs to assess the risks associated with your service providers, it's then really important, of course, to take some concrete actions to address these risks and to prevent them from materializing in practice. Information taken from the SAQ is a good way of prioritizing suppliers, but obviously the risks are theoretical. If no action is taken, then there is the real risk that those risks will materialize in practice or exist already. And so to be effective, the management of these risks is likely to take a combination of forms. And one of the most effective ways to mitigate risks is by providers to build their capacity to manage these issues internally. For example, this might involve training on topics with the risks that you've identified through your risk assessment. So that might be occupational health and safety, waste management best practices, or fair recruitment processes, depending on the risks that you've identified common to the sector that the service provider is involved in, the country they're located in, and the information that you've gathered through self-assessment. So by investing in capacity building like this, you'll not only be mitigating risks, but also enhancing the long-term sustainability of your business partners, which is, of course, in turn, good for your business. Conducting regular assessments of any supplier is also a critical part of ESG risk management. That includes suppliers of goods, but it also includes suppliers of services. And audits like SMETA, the SEDEX members ethical trade audit, allow you to assess compliance with labour and health and safety standards, as well as business ethics and environmental management systems. And that will assess suppliers both in terms of the local law in the context in which they operate, but also against international standards like the conventions set out by the International Labour Organization and kind of codified by the Ethical Trading Initiative through the base code of which the SMETA audit is based around. But it's important to note that auditing alone is not enough, even if that does identify risks and help you address non-compliances and develop corrective action plans with your suppliers. It's also important to see your relationship with your service provider as a partnership, and collaboration between clients and their service providers is really essential for achieving long-term social and environmental improvements. This could include joint initiatives to improve working conditions or reduce environmental impacts, for example. And it's a simple point, but establishing open communication channels and partnerships with service providers just helps ensure that they understand and align with your ESG goals. So that can be simple things, just like having initial meetings with service providers to help understand, what it is they're doing, to set out your expectations and work together on some of these issues. So The reality is that carrying out human rights due diligence and establishing partnerships with service providers, it does require an investment of time and resources. So for anyone listening who might need to make the business case internally, we also want to spend a minute just emphasizing the tangible benefits that this can and should deliver. So we know that consumers and investors are increasingly favoring companies that demonstrate a strong commitment to sustainability and human rights. So by supporting your service providers to comply with ethical and legal standards, you'll be mitigating the risk of any damage that could arise from public scandals or non-compliance, and also importantly, narrative about the action that you're taking as a responsible business. Proactively addressing ESG risks associated with service providers also reduces the likelihood of risks like operational disruptions and regulatory penalties. For example, identifying and addressing labour abuses in high-risk sectors can potentially prevent costly legal issues further down the line and minimise the risk of reputational harm. And finally, by engaging with service providers to improve their ESG performance, you can contribute to those broader societal goals of sustainability. This will not only enhance the resilience of your own value chain, but it also supports global efforts to address critical issues like climate change, the protection of human rights, and address social inequality. Many of you, no doubt, will be familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, and I think they're a really good reference point for businesses who want to publicly demonstrate how the actions they're taking are supporting these global objectives. And of course, there are several SDGs that are highly aligned with any actions you would take to reduce service provider risks, not only SDG 8 on decent work, but also SDG 13 on climate action, and others that would be very much aligned with the action you're taking and able to kind of demonstrate both internally within your business and externally how the action that you're taking is contributing to these greater global goals. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'll now hand back to Tom to conclude the presentation before we open to questions. But please, as Tom said earlier, do continue to post your questions in the chat, and we'll be able to take those in a couple of minutes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. I think that was a really good overview from both Tom and Sad around how service providers have their own specific human rights and environmental risks, and also around that regulation is driving mandatory due diligence, and also the fact that actually there's not just the benefit of complying with legislation, there's also reputation benefits to your business, the fact that you can reduce the risk as well from external sources, as well as the long-term sustainability benefits that drive your business's goals and objectives as well. Just want to touch on a brief plug. We have various solutions that we support businesses from all sectors across, whether that's our platform, our audit methodology, or any of our professional services as well. So if you're interested, please get in touch with us. We've had a few questions over today's webinar, so I'll put those to the speakers now. If you have any additional questions that you'd like us to elaborate on, please ask them in the chat now. So one for you, Tom, I think there is here around what can we do if one of our service providers fails to meet the ESG requirements?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the first thing to say is that you can probably expect, at least initially, that most service providers will be non-compliant with the requirements that you set out in terms of the ethical standards that they should be meeting. We see that in the data on the SEDEX platform, that really what we're expecting from organizations is a level of maturity that's not quite there in terms of being able to really meet all of the requirements set out by international labour standards. So the purpose of conducting due diligence really is to establish a dialogue between the buying companies and their suppliers to ultimately prevent adverse impacts. And so the key here when you identify non-compliance is to understand whether you see a willingness to address any of those harms that might have taken place and to take measures that will mitigate the risks in the future. The really important thing to remember here is that the primary lens through which we conduct due diligence is the risk to workers. So some companies we know might be tempted when they see non-compliances or with their service providers is to kind of move away from those service providers and use others. But that really doesn't have any benefit to workers. So terminating a relationship with a service provider should really be seen as a last resort. the key is to identify, what's driving the potential non-compliance, the failure to meet the requirements, and work together to address those, ultimately benefiting those workers. And only, as I say, as a very last resort to potentially terminate a relationship.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. We've got a question here around, do I have to pay so that my suppliers can use the platform, or do they pay for themselves? I'm happy to answer this. So typically what will happen is that a buying organization will join SEDEX and pay a membership fee and request their suppliers to join. Their suppliers will pay for their own membership, so that's not on behalf of buyers. Some businesses in the past have asked to pay for their suppliers' membership, but typically suppliers will pay on a per site basis. And also typically the suppliers will also pay for the audits for their sites as well. So the cost is avoided by the buying organization there. And again, the benefit of SMETA is that it can be shared with multiple customers as well. So we know that the pressures against suppliers of audit fatigue is quite a lot. So the benefit of SMETA is that they can be audited once and share that audit with multiple buyers as well. So hopefully that answers your question there. We've got another question, Tom, I think for you. What can we do if we don't have the internal resources to mitigate all the risks we identify?
Yeah, another good question. This is quite a likely scenario. I think at least initially, if you're starting out with potentially low resource within your business and conducting a risk assessment, it's very likely that you will identify a number of potential risks. And in this scenario, the advice really is to take a risk-based approach. So you might set out a matrix really that's looking at how serious the impact potentially is, the number of people that could potentially be impacted, and how difficult it would be to remediate the situation. So not all risks need to be treated equally. There could be a scenario where a large number of people could be impacted by something that it could be very difficult to remediate if it occurs, and that the severity to those people could be very high. So in those cases, you would prioritize the risks that are most severe and most likely to occur before then kind of taking a gradual approach to move on to address any other adverse impacts. So I think there's not an expectation that you'd be able to address every single risk identified. It's more about identifying those that have the biggest potential to cause harm and taking action for those first of all.
That's super helpful, Tom. And I think one thing just to say is the SEDEX platform does that particularly well in terms of it gives scores and highlights that to our members. So it gives you a sort of idea if they're high, medium or low risks, and it actually allows you to prioritize your supplies if you've got a lot and you don't know where to start. It's really useful to find out and understand where to start as well. There's a question here, I think this is, unfortunately, Tom, these are for you, but is SAQ is self-assessed information. Do you offer verified assessments for service providers?
Sam, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we currently have a SMETA audit, our methodology, which is suitable for those service providers who have a fixed location or have site-based workers. But for service providers who are working in multiple locations or who are mobile and do not have a fixed location, we do understand that traditional verification methods like SMETA may not be suitable due to the nature of their operations. So it is on our roadmap to offer a verification service for such service providers. So we are currently exploring alternative verification methods, and we are working towards offering a solution that can cover these kind of service providers.
Brilliant. Thanks, Seb. And another question here, can service providers use the SAQ as a benchmark for continuous improvement?
Yeah, I can take that one. So yes, service providers can use the SAQ to improve their policies and practices on a continuous basis. And that is on the back of the management control score, which is one of the outputs you get after you complete the service provider SAQ, which gives you a breakdown of your score based on the four SMETA pillars like business ethics, health and safety, labor standards, and it also tells you which are the areas that you are doing good and which are the areas that you need to further improve. So it gives you a good breakdown of the score, and you can use those scores to really make continuous improvement.
Okay, thanks, sir. I've got a question here. Is the methodology also applicable to food producers?
Yes, so the service provider SAQ that Sab talked about would be specifically to service providers, but also we have a separate questionnaire that is relevant to providers of goods, so manufacturing sites or farms, and that could include food producers. So those companies operating out of a fixed location will receive a questionnaire within the platform. And additionally, the SMETA audit is used widely for food producers. Yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. Fab. Thank you. I've got another question here. The service provider can be audited against the SMETA audit methodology. If possible, the service provider SAQ questionnaire and the audit questionnaire will be the same. I think that's probably asking around the similarities between the self-assessment questionnaire and also the SMETA audit methodology, and if it's possible to audit service providers. Tom?
Yeah, so one of the main kind of objectives of the self-assessment questionnaire is to help a supplier or a service provider to understand the expectations of a SMETA audit, which will be based on international labour standards. So there's a strong correlation between the contents of the SAQ and the sections that are covered, which will be things like working hours and wages and health and safety and non-discrimination, forced labour, and the content of a SMETA audit as well. So in doing so, it helps any kind of respondent to really understand what are the expectations and how can I potentially prepare and take corrective actions in advance of an audit taking place. Exactly that.
Great. Thanks, Tom. There's one more question that I can see here, Tom. I don't know if you want to give it a go. It's a tough one. It's one that we get quite a lot, but it's around how do we qualify small service providers who are reluctant or unable to pay SEDEX joining fees or afford audits and that type of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think the main response is that SEDEX really tries as much as possible to keep the registration fees for what we refer to as B members, so supplier members, as low as possible. Additionally, within the questionnaire itself, I think there's a couple of different points to mention. One is that we tailor the question set according to the size of the supplier. So we recognize that it's not necessarily appropriate to ask the same level of questions to a very small organization as it is to a larger one. We know that that can be off-putting and time-consuming for smaller suppliers without kind of huge amounts of resources. And so we do tailor the questionnaire based on the company size. A smaller service provider will receive a fewer number of questions and hopefully make that process easier for them to get through. And then I think the second point is really about trying to help those service providers understand the benefits to them and not seeing it purely as a compliance task, but also how they can use the questions within the questionnaire to understand what good looks like, understand where gaps are potentially in their systems that they might be able to strengthen to meet those expectations of international labour standards, which are coming from human rights due diligence, right? So within the questionnaire, we have a lot of guidance and explanatory text that explains, why this question is being asked, what this section means, and at the end of completing the questionnaire, every supplier will receive a report back called a management controls report. They'll receive a score and a report, and that will identify potential areas where they could make improvements. So not only are they kind of going through a questionnaire in order to comply with their customers' requirements, but they're getting value out of this, identifying potential areas to improve, to strengthen their systems, reduce their risks, and ultimately be more kind of a robust business, but also compliant with the policies of their customers. But yeah, of course, do recognize that there is a small cost associated with registering on the SEDEX platform, but hopefully the benefits that they'll receive outweigh that.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I think it's worth mentioning as well some other options that we have had businesses who pay for their suppliers' memberships as well as part of that if they can't afford that, and also outlining to the suppliers the importance of this as well. Companies who hit the requirements and the scope of mandatory due diligence legislations that are coming. It's mandatory not just to do your direct suppliers, but also all tiers of suppliers as well. So suppliers will be asked of this, no matter their size, to support businesses with their mandatory due diligence as well. So thanks for your questions. Got another one here. If your supplier is considered as a high-risk supplier and we decide to take a SMETA audit, how long does it take and how to proceed? Now, I know we haven't got anyone from our SMETA team here, but Tom, do you want to? I think you've got enough skin in the game to be able to answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, SEDEX doesn't conduct the audit, so there's a lot of variability. In essence, it will be based on the size of that supplier, the number of workers, the country they're located in, the audit firms that are available to conduct that audit. So SEDEX has a list of approved audit companies, affiliate audit companies or AACs that are published on our website. And the best way to find out the potential cost of an audit is to contact one of those audit companies and take a quote from them. SEDEX doesn't provide the actual audit service itself. You need to contact the audit firm.
And also that varies depending on the type of pillar that you want. SMETA has 2-pillar and 4-pillar SMETA audits, and the 4-pillar basically includes environmental and business ethics functions as well. So there's different costs there as well. Nice. Is there a way to simplify the number of audits, assessments in the industry? I mean, a package that covers all important requirements, etc. So I don't mind covering this, Tom. You might be able to help me cover some of these points, but I think there's different solutions. Like SEDEX will either go at supply level, at headquarter level, or site level. We usually find, and also legislation is requiring for companies to monitor at site level. So you can't really address the verification and due diligence and also assessment at headquarter level without going down to site level. But Tom, any ideas on how to simplify that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that the SMETA audit is essentially that. If you think back to the founding reasons of SEDEX, it was to reduce duplication in social auditing. So the idea is of having a single centralized platform where an audit report can be shared with multiple customers is exactly that, to reduce that duplication, to not have multiple customers requesting different audits, and to just have one single audit that's shared on the SEDEX platform and can be viewed by all of those customers. I guess where that the limitation potentially is in terms of the scope of that audit and what it covers. The SMETA audit will be very focused on health and safety, labour standards, environmental management systems, and business ethics management systems. There, of course, are other audits that will be beyond the scope of that are not really going to be within the scope of a SMETA audit. But as much as possible, we do, as a business, encourage the sharing of a single audit to reduce duplication and allow suppliers to focus their efforts on addressing some of the issues that are identified rather than just suffering this audit fatigue.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. I think that's all of the questions we've got for today. So unless there's any more, we will conclude this webinar. A quick plug, if you're interested in hearing more from SEDEX, we've got a virtual conference on the 10th to 11th of December as well. So we'll be covering a host of various topics from regulation and across supplier engagement. So feel free, you can scan there or visit our website and you'll be able to find more information about the conference. But that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. The slides and emails will be sent to you after this webinar. So thank you. Have a good day. Bye.